When you begin speaking to yourself the way creation speaks, not with doubt, not with hesitation, but with the quiet authority of something that already knows, something within your interior architecture begins to rearrange itself. Reality, that seemingly fixed and stubborn landscape you navigate every day, starts to bend, not dramatically, not overnight, but with the same quiet certainty that water reshapes stone over time. This is the principle at the center of everything you're about to hear. Your inner dialogue is not a private matter. It is the most public broadcast you will ever make, transmitted not through airwaves or signals, but through the very fabric of your experience. Everything you have ever lived, every door that opened or closed, every relationship that flourished or faded, every opportunity that found you or missed you, all of it was first spoken into existence in the quiet chambers of your own mind. Before we go further, understand this. What you are about to encounter is not a self-help formula. It is not a prescription, and it carries no guarantees, because the universe does not deal in guarantees. It deals in resonance. What this exploration may offer is a new way of hearing yourself, and through that hearing, a new way of constructing the world around you. The ancient wisdom traditions, the emerging fields of consciousness research, and the lived experiences of countless ordinary people across centuries all seem to arrive at the same quiet conclusion. The voice inside you is not neutral. It is not a passive narrator. It is an architect. Your thoughts are not stored quietly in some private vault, inaccessible to the world. They radiate each time you whisper to yourself, each time you silently declare who you are, what you deserve, what is possible for you. You are emitting a signal that the intelligence woven through existence seems to receive and respond to, not because of magic, not because of mythology, but because of something far simpler and far more profound. The law of resonance. Like attracts like. Frequency matches frequency. The interior state you inhabit consistently becomes the template from which your exterior experience is constructed. Consider the way Hazel Montgomery moved through her days. On the surface, she appeared capable, organized, thoughtful, present. But beneath the surface of her actions ran a quiet and relentless current, a whispered mantra she had never consciously chosen, but had somehow inherited. I am always overlooked. She did not announce this to people. She did not write it down, but she spoke it constantly, in the wordless language of expectation, in the way she entered a room, in the slight, downward tilt of her eyes when an idea of hers was introduced in conversation, in the way she preemptively minimized herself before others had the chance to do it. And life, that faithful and attentive mirror, reflected it back. Her ideas circled meetings without landing. Opportunities seemed to veer slightly to the left of where she stood. Relationships carried the faint quality of an echo, present but not quite solid. The law operating here is not punitive. It is not personal. It is simply precise. The universe does not evaluate your desires. It does not assess your worthiness based on your history or your intentions. It simply responds to the frequency of your most consistent inner utterance. When you speak limitation fluently and repeatedly, the intelligence that organizes experience does not interpret this as a lament. It receives it as instruction. This is the part that most people never grasp. Your inner dialogue is not describing your reality. It is building it. Now consider Lionel Pierce, who understood this not through formal study, but through something closer to intuition. He was not a philosopher or a teacher. He was a man who had discovered, through years of quiet observation, that the words he spoke to himself in unremarkable moments, while rinsing dishes, while driving familiar roads, while folding clothes, carried a weight that his louder, more deliberate statements did not. And so he began, in those ordinary moments, to whisper something simple. Everything I engage with moves toward goodness, not as a wish, not as a plea, as a quiet, settled recognition. Within weeks, not months, not years, the texture of his days changed. Connections appeared with a kind of unforced grace. Professional openings materialized in ways that logic could not quite account for. Resources that had seemed inaccessible began to surface through unexpected channels. What Lionel had understood was this: the universe responds not to the volume of your declarations, but to the depth of your conviction. A thunderous proclamation made from a place of inner doubt carries less creative weight than a soft whisper rooted in genuine knowing. The gentle consistency of your inner stream, not the dramatic intensity of your occasional announcements, is what the organizing intelligence of existence most reliably receives. This is why so many people repeat affirmations and experience nothing. They speak the words, but beneath the words, a louder and older voice is broadcasting something entirely different. The affirmation says, I am prosperous. The deeper current says, but I have always struggled. And the universe, which is a listener of remarkable sensitivity, hears not the surface statement, but the underlying signal. Your job, if there is a job here at all, is not to shout louder. It is to bring the deeper current into alignment with what you are choosing to create. This begins with learning to actually listen to yourself, not the version of yourself you present to others, the version that speaks in the unguarded moments, the voice that narrates your morning before you have put on any social performance. That voice, honest, unfiltered, habitual, is your truest broadcast, and it is the one that most shapes what arrives in your life. The person who quietly assumes that good things require exhausting effort will find that every good thing does indeed arrive through exhaustion. The person who has internalized, at a level beneath conscious thought, that they are fundamentally alone, will find that even surrounded by people, a quality of isolation persists. These are not punishments. They are correspondences, the outer world arranging itself with faithful precision to match the inner one. Now, here is where the story begins to pivot, because if the inner state creates the outer experience, then the path to transformation is not external. You do not need to find the right opportunity. You do not need to meet the right person. You do not need circumstances to align before you can shift. The shift begins in the conversation you are having with yourself right now, in this moment, and in all the moments that follow this one. Consider how Ellie Mae Thompson lived for years in the space between desire and action. She was drawn to painting with a pull she could not explain, not as a hobby or a pastime, but as something that felt like language, like the truest way she knew to speak. But every time she sat before a blank canvas, a voice arrived first. I am not talented enough. And the canvas remained blank. Not because she lacked ability, not because the world had withheld opportunity, but because her assumption about herself was so consistent, so settled, so completely unquestioned, that it had become the lens through which every creative impulse was filtered and diminished. She was not expressing doubt, she was designing reality. Your assumptions are not opinions. They are seeds. When you plant a seed with consistent emotional conviction, it does not ask your permission before it grows. It simply grows. The fertile ground of your subconscious receives whatever you plant with regularity and tends to it with extraordinary faithfulness. This is why the quality of your inner conversation matters more than the quality of your circumstances. Circumstances can change overnight, but an assumption that has been watered daily for years will outlast any circumstance unless you consciously choose to plant something different. Chester Doyle understood this with a clarity that transformed his world without requiring any external revolution. He was a clerk. By every visible measure, his station was modest, his trajectory unremarkable. But in the privacy of his inner landscape, Chester did not identify as a clerk. He moved through his days with the quiet interior posture of someone who naturally guided and inspired others. He spoke to himself not from his current position, but from his chosen identity. And gradually, not because the world changed first, but because his inner frequency changed, the world began to reorganize around him. His interactions shifted. People began to respond to something in him that he had first decided was there. Leadership, it turned out, was not a title, it was a vibration. Your identity is not a fixed condition, it is a narrative, and you are its author. The only question is whether you are writing it consciously or by default. Most people write it by default, inheriting descriptions of themselves from early experiences, absorbing the assessments of others, allowing accumulated evidence to define the limits of what feels possible. But evidence is always a report from the past. It tells you what has been, not what is becoming. When you begin to author your identity from a place of chosen certainty rather than inherited circumstance, you step into a creative capacity that most people never access. Betty Lou Carter had built an elaborate architecture of doubt over the course of her life. Each morning arrived not as a blank canvas, but as a stage already set for failure. Her mind would rehearse the ways things might unravel before the day had offered a single actual experience. What if I fall short? What if it dissolves? And, true to the law of resonance, her days would arrange themselves to confirm what she had already decided. She was not a pessimist by choice. She was a doubter by habit, and habits, left unexamined, masquerade as truth. Then there was Wendell Brooks, who had discovered what Betty had not yet found: that faith is not the absence of uncertainty, but the presence of a different kind of knowing. Wendell did not pretend challenges didn't exist. He did not construct a false brightness over the actual texture of his experience. What he did was choose, repeatedly and deliberately, where he placed his inner attention. When professional connections seemed absent, He closed his eyes and occupied a different interior space, one where encounters flowed with natural timing, where the right people arrived through unexpected doors. His inner conversation was not, "I hope this happens." It was, "This is already in motion." And slowly, with the consistency of water finding its level, his outer world rearranged itself accordingly. This is the alchemy that seems impossible until you witness it, and then seems inevitable. The organizing intelligence of existence does not respond to what you wish for. It responds to what you consistently assume, not what you pray for occasionally, not what you visualize with great effort once a week, what you fundamentally, habitually, beneath all performance believe to be true about yourself and about life. That is the frequency you are always broadcasting. That is the instruction the universe most reliably receives. And here is where a certain stillness becomes essential, because most people are so immersed in the outer noise, the demands, the distractions, the endless flow of information, that they never actually hear what their inner voice is saying. The signal is constant, but the listening is absent. There is a man who spent years seeking answers in books, in seminars, in conversations, in practices, and all the while, the answer was being spoken by the quietest voice in the room, his own. The practice is not complicated. It is simply this: begin to listen, not to the version of your inner voice that performs for an imagined audience, the unguarded version, the one that speaks when you wake at 3 in the morning, the one that narrates as you walk through a parking lot, stand in an elevator, wait for a call that hasn't come. What is that voice saying? Not about the news, not about other people, about you, about what is possible for you, about what you deserve, about what tends to happen in your life. That voice is your primary creative instrument, and it is always playing whether you are aware of it or not. The question is not whether to have an inner dialogue. You cannot choose that. The question is whether to have it consciously, to bring to it the same quality of intention you might bring to anything you care about, or to leave it running on automatic, repeating the patterns it inherited, building the same architecture it has always built. The intelligence at the center of creation, whatever name you give it, whatever framework makes it accessible to you, is not indifferent to your inner conversation. It does not ignore the signals you transmit with such consistency and emotional force. It receives them, and with a faithfulness that can feel either like a miracle or a curse, depending on what you have been broadcasting, it translates them into form. When you whisper to yourself with quiet certainty, when you speak of your life not as a complaint, but as a declaration, something in the invisible architecture of your experience begins to reorganize, not because you have performed a ritual, not because you have said the right words, but because the frequency of your inner state has shifted. And in that shift, the world you encounter shifts with it. This is the beginning, not a technique, not a formula, a reorientation, a turning of your attention inward with genuine curiosity and genuine willingness to hear what is actually being said. And then, with the same patience a gardener brings to a new season, to begin planting something different. Some who encounter this teaching for the first time feel a quiet recognition, as if they have heard this before, in some language older than words. If that recognition is present in you now, you might find yourself drawn to pause here and mark this moment. There is a number, 777, that appears across traditions of consciousness and awareness as a symbol of alignment between the seen and the unseen, between what you intend and what the universe is already organizing on your behalf. If something in this opening passage stirred something in you, those who choose to mark such moments sometimes simply write it, not as a ritual, not as a task, just as a quiet acknowledgement that something here was received. Mildred Lane had spent the better part of her adult life in a particular relationship with prayer, one that looked from the outside like devotion, but felt from the inside like begging. She would approach the invisible with cupped hands and a lowered head, her words carrying the texture of someone who was not entirely sure they deserved an answer. Her conversations with whatever she understood to be greater than herself were tinged with apology, with the quiet assumption that she was interrupting something important, that her requests were burdens rather than expressions of a natural and sacred communion. And the universe, that faithful correspondent, responded in kind, with the same fragmented, hesitant quality that her inner posture broadcast. What she received mirrored precisely what she had assumed she was worthy of receiving. The sacred wisdom that runs through every genuine tradition of inner transformation points to the same truth. The intelligence that organizes existence does not respond to the desperation of your request. It responds to the quality of your inner standing. When you approach the cosmic conversation as a supplicant, diminished, uncertain, braced for denial, the signal you emit is one of scarcity, of separation, of fundamental unworthiness. And that signal, broadcast with the consistency of deep belief, becomes the architecture of your experience. Young Everett Crane discovered something different while walking among trees whose branches had absorbed centuries of silence. He began to speak, not to an authority above him, not to a force beyond him, but with a presence he recognized as intelligent, present, and already aware of his deepest nature. His words were not requests, they were not negotiations. They were the language of mutual recognition, calm, unhurried, rooted in the understanding that the conversation had always been available and that he had simply, finally, decided to show up for it fully. And something in the quality of his days shifted with a subtlety that made it, at first, easy to dismiss. Peace stopped arriving occasionally and started residing. Pathways that had appeared blocked began to reveal their openings. Opportunities did not announce themselves with fanfare. They whispered their arrival, soft and unmistakable, the way a door sounds when it has been quietly unlocked from the other side. Your relationship with the animating intelligence of existence is not hierarchical. You are not below it, petitioning upward. You are not required to earn its attention or prove your worthiness before it will respond. The relationship is one of resonance, of attunement, of alignment. When your inner conversation carries the tone of someone who understands their own inherent connection to the source of all creation, the universe does not suddenly become more generous. It simply becomes more visible. What was always present becomes accessible. What was always available becomes received. This is not about spiritual performance. It is not about adopting a particular vocabulary or following a prescribed practice. It is about the quality of your inner tone, the felt sense of who you are in relation to life itself. When that tone is one of reverence rather than desperation, of dialogue rather than petition, of recognition rather than pleading, the entire character of your experience begins to shift, not because you have performed something correctly, but because you have changed the frequency of your broadcast. And the universe, that faithful and precise responder, adjusts accordingly. Dorothy Wren had lived for years in a landscape she experienced primarily through the lens of what was absent. There was never quite enough money, never quite the right timing, never quite the opportunity she needed. Her inner dialogue had become so fluent in the language of scarcity that she no longer recognized it as a language at all. It simply felt like reality. The water someone has always swum in does not feel like water. It feels like the world. Dorothy's inner conversation was a continuous, largely unconscious broadcast of insufficiency. And, like all broadcasts, it was received and reflected back to her with remarkable consistency. Then something small changed. Not a revelation, not a dramatic turning point, just a quiet introduction to a different way of relating to what she had. She began, tentatively at first, with more skepticism than conviction, to speak in the language of gratitude, not gratitude for what had arrived, but gratitude for what was already in motion. Thank you for the current that is carrying what I need. Thank you for the channels that are already opening. Thank you for the abundance that is already present, even where I cannot yet see it. At first, it felt hollow. The skepticism was honest, and she did not try to disguise it. But she continued anyway, because something in the principle made a kind of interior sense she could not dismiss. And slowly, over days and then weeks, the quality of her inner landscape began to shift, not because her circumstances changed dramatically, but because her relationship to her circumstances changed. And then, with the quiet inevitability of a tide turning, her circumstances began to change too. Not all at once, not in the way dramatic stories of transformation are told, but in the way real change moves, gradually, then unmistakably. Franklin Pope had understood this principle not as a discovery, but as a practice he had cultivated deliberately over years. Each morning, before the day had declared its intentions, he would stand at his window and address what was already in motion with acknowledgement and thanks. He did not wait for evidence before extending gratitude. He understood that gratitude extended before evidence is not denial. It is a declaration of a different order of perception. It signals to the organizing intelligence of existence not that you are pretending difficulty doesn't exist, but that you have chosen to place your primary attention on what is moving toward you rather than what seems to be absent. And that shift of attention, quiet, consistent, genuine, becomes a creative force of remarkable potency. This is the mystical mathematics of a grateful inner life. When you praise what is unseen, you make visible the pathways through which it arrives. Your thankfulness is not a transaction. You are not trading gratitude for outcomes. It is an attunement, a shift of your inner frequency toward one that naturally receives more of what you are genuinely grateful for. The beacon of genuine appreciation is, it seems, one of the most powerful transmissions a human consciousness can emit. There is a practice embedded in all of this that requires no special circumstances, no particular environment, no retreat from ordinary life. It requires only the willingness to pause in the middle of a morning, at the threshold of a difficult afternoon, in the quiet moment before sleep, and to speak inwardly from a place of genuine recognition of what is already present and what is already moving toward you, not as a script, not as a performance, as a real, felt acknowledgement that abundance is not a future condition to be achieved, but a present reality to be recognized. The imagination is where all of this begins to take shape in ways the rational mind can engage with more directly. Marjorie Tate had spent years looking at her life and seeing primarily what was fixed, the walls, the limits, the evidence of what had not changed. She saw her circumstances as information about what was possible. This is one of the most common and most limiting confusions a human mind can inhabit. The belief that evidence from the past is a reliable guide to what the future can hold. Evidence is always a record of what has already been created. It carries no information about what is becoming. When Marjorie first learned to occupy the space of imagination, not as escape, but as creative workshop, to hold interior scenes of the life she was choosing with the same sensory specificity she brought to her memories, something in her interior architecture began to shift. The mind, it turns out, does not reliably distinguish between what is vividly imagined and what is physically experienced. The same neural territories activate, the same emotional states arise, and the same signals, therefore, are broadcast into the field of existence that is always listening, always receiving, always organizing itself around the frequency of your most consistent inner state. Calvin Reed inhabited this understanding with a natural ease. When the professional turbulence around him would have been more than sufficient justification for anxiety and reactive thinking, he chose instead to cultivate interior scenes of resolution, of calm, of graceful outcomes, of challenges met with unexpected simplicity. Not because he was naive about the real nature of his circumstances, but because he understood that his inner landscape was not a commentary on what was happening. It was a template for what was about to happen. And he had decided, deliberately and consistently, to hold a template of peace rather than a template of struggle. The universe, receiving that template with its characteristic precision, began organizing his exterior world accordingly. Your imagination is not a leisure activity. It is not the thing you do when you are done with the real work. It is the first act of creation, the space in which every transformation begins before it becomes visible. When you hold an interior image with genuine feeling, with the quiet certainty that what you are imagining is not a wish, but a seed. When you bring to it the emotional texture of experience rather than the intellectual texture of hope, you are engaging with the most fundamental mechanism of creation available to you. Jeanette Moore had, for years, been an unwilling demonstration of the power of emotional frequency as a creative force. She did not understand herself as someone who was creating her experience. She understood herself as someone to whom things happened, and from that position of passive recipient rather than active creator, she experienced the full consequences of an inner emotional life she had never examined or chosen. The spilled coffee that triggered a cascade of frustration was not a cause, it was a match held to tinder that had been accumulating for years. The emotional state of braced irritability that ran just beneath the surface of her days was a constant broadcast, and life was a faithful receiver, arranging daily circumstances to confirm and continue the signal. Gregory Watson had chosen differently, not once, but repeatedly, in the small daily moments that most people dismiss as inconsequential. He did not wait for joy to be delivered by circumstances. He cultivated it as an interior state before any external evidence justified it. He chose appreciation in the absence of obvious reasons to appreciate. He chose ease before difficulty had resolved, and what he found, consistently over time, with a reliability that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, was that the emotional frequency he inhabited before events shaped the events that followed. His inner state was not a response to his life. It was the instruction from which his life was being built. This is the most radical and most liberating understanding available to a human consciousness. You are not at the mercy of your emotions. Your emotions are not accurate reports about fixed reality. They are creative frequencies, broadcasts that the field of existence receives and mirrors back with exacting faithfulness. When you take genuine authorship of your inner emotional climate, not through suppression, not through performance, but through conscious and sustained choice, you take authorship of the experience that follows. The words you speak to yourself carry more weight than most people will ever investigate. Lillian Frost knew this not through abstraction, but through the lived poetry of her garden, through the daily, patient, faithful work of tending something from seed to fullness. She understood in her hands and in her back the truth that all growth requires consistent attention, patient nurturing, and the deep faith of someone who plants a seed in dark soil and trusts, not because they can see the evidence, but because they understand the law. Her affirmations were not desperate. They were not urgent. They moved through her days the way she moved through her garden, with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows that growth is not something you force, but something you tend. Growth comes naturally, she would say, not as an incantation, but as a recognition. And in the saying, she was not merely describing what she hoped for. She was watering something real. Clyde Monroe discovered the same principle in his professional life, finding that the consistent, low-pressure affirmation of ease in his work, not the dramatic insistence on it, but the gentle, repeated assumption of it, gradually transformed the actual texture of his days, not because he had performed some technique correctly, but because he had shifted the frequency of his most habitual inner utterance, and the universe, that precise and faithful correspondent, had adjusted the output to match. Your words are never idle, even the ones you whisper without intention, without awareness, in the spaces between more deliberate thoughts. They carry vibrational weight. They travel through the invisible architecture of consciousness and signal, with quiet persistence, what you most fundamentally believe to be true. This is why the practice of bringing genuine consciousness to your inner speech is not a luxury or a spiritual extra. It is the most practical work available to you. The silence between words is where the deepest signal lives. Frances Lamb had never found stillness comfortable. Her mind was a landscape of perpetual motion, planning, evaluating, rehearsing, analyzing, and she had long mistaken this motion for productivity. She could not distinguish between the activity of genuine thought and the static of a mind that had simply never been shown how to rest. The signal she was broadcasting was consequently fragmented, crossed with interference, unable to carry the clarity that genuine intention requires. Herbert Price had discovered what Francis had not yet found, that the silence available in even 10 minutes of genuine stillness each day was not an absence. It was a presence, a quality of receptive openness in which the guidance that had always been available became, finally, audible, not as voices or visions, but as the quiet clarity of knowing, the kind of knowing that arrives not through analysis, but through a deeper channel, one that only opens when the surface noise has been allowed to settle. In that stillness, Herbert found that the problems which had resisted hours of effortful thinking would offer their solutions with an ease that seemed almost embarrassing. The insights that arrived in silence carried a different quality than the conclusions he reached through force. They felt more true. They held longer. They led somewhere. This is the teaching that silence carries. You are not required to figure everything out. You are not responsible for solving the mystery of your life through relentless cognitive effort. There is an intelligence available to you, accessible through the quality of your inner listening, that is considerably wiser than the thinking mind operating in isolation. Your inner world is a sanctuary, and silence is the practice that makes it accessible. Before this first movement of the journey closes, there is one more thing worth holding. Nora Blake had chased transformation through intensity, through grand gestures and peak experiences, and the kind of dramatic encounters with meaning that make for compelling stories. But true change, the kind that persists, the kind that gradually and irreversibly reshapes the texture of a life, does not move that way. It moves the way Martin Ellis's mornings moved, quietly, repeatedly, without drama, with the patient confidence of someone who understands that the universe responds to consistency more than it responds to intensity. Each word Martin whispered to himself in the early stillness of his mornings was a seed, not a thunderbolt, a seed. And seeds, tended with regularity and genuine faith, become the gardens through which abundance eventually walks. If something in this passage has settled differently than words usually settle, if there is a quality of recognition present rather than simply information received, you might find this a natural moment to pause. Those who work with resonance and awareness sometimes use the number 1111 as a marker of alignment, a signal not that something external has been achieved, but that an interior convergence is underway. If this feels true to your experience in this moment, some people find it meaningful to simply note it, not as instruction, just as acknowledgement. The sacred routine is not born in the extraordinary. It is born in the willingness to return, again and again, without demanding that each return feel significant, to the simple, unhurried practice of speaking to yourself with intention. Most people wait for inspiration before they begin. They wait to feel ready, to feel certain, to feel the presence of something larger before they commit to the daily work of inner alignment. But inspiration, it turns out, is far more often a consequence of consistent practice than a prerequisite for it. You do not wait for the garden to look beautiful before you water it. You water it faithfully and without drama, and the beauty follows from the faithfulness. Martin Ellis had understood this not as a philosophy, but as a lived reality. His morning ritual was not elaborate. It did not require equipment or a particular environment or an hour carved from a demanding schedule. It required only the willingness to arrive before the day's momentum had gathered, before the weight of obligations had settled, and to speak in the quiet of his own interior from the person he had chosen to be rather than the person circumstance might have assigned him. I am calm. I am capable. I am moving in the right direction. These were not performances. They were orientation. The daily act of pointing his inner compass before the winds of external demand had a chance to redirect it. And gradually, with the quiet inevitability that consistent inner work produces, his exterior world began to reflect the interior state he had chosen to inhabit. Not because he had spoken magic words, not because the universe had rewarded his effort, but because the frequency of his most habitual inner utterance had shifted, and the field of existence, that precise and faithful mirror, had adjusted the reflection accordingly. This is the invitation that closes this first movement of the journey. Begin where you are, with what you have, in whatever small window of stillness your life currently allows. Bring to your inner conversation the same quality of care and intention you would bring to anything you genuinely valued. Speak to yourself not as someone managing a difficult situation, but as someone who understands that the situation is, in its deepest nature, already responding to the voice you choose to use. The sacred routine is not a practice you add to your life. It is the practice through which your life slowly and then unmistakably becomes something you have genuinely chosen. Trust is a frequency before it is a feeling. Most people experience it the other way around. They wait to feel trust before they choose to broadcast it. They want the evidence first, the reassurance, the confirmation, the visible sign that things are moving in the right direction before they allow their inner voice to settle into certainty. But this sequence, wait for evidence, then trust, inverts the actual law of creation. Evidence does not precede trust. Evidence follows it. The inner state of unshakable quiet confidence is not the reward for a life that has gone well. It is the creative force that produces one. Clarice Jenkins had lived for years inside the experience of a mind that had learned to brace. Her history had given her more than enough material to justify a posture of defensive anticipation. Jobs that had dissolved without warning, relationships that had ended in confusion, opportunities that had appeared and then retreated before she could fully receive them. She had become skilled at preparing for disappointment, mistaking that preparation for wisdom, for realism, for the mature understanding of how life actually worked. Her inner voice had become a sophisticated early warning system, always scanning for the next thing that would go wrong. And the universe, receiving that signal with its characteristic faithfulness, continued to provide material for the scan. Oscar Boone moved through the same world with a different interior posture. He was not naive. He had faced genuine difficulty and genuine loss. But somewhere in the texture of his experience, he had arrived at a different understanding. Not that life was without challenge, but that the quality of his inner response to challenge shaped what the challenge became. His inner voice did not predict outcomes from a place of fear. It declared them from a place of quiet knowing. I am guided toward what serves my growth. Everything arrives with the timing that serves me best. These were not affirmations spoken over a backdrop of doubt. They were settled beliefs, the kind that live below the level of conscious thought and quietly organize experience from beneath. Slowly, Clarice began the work of shifting her own inner narrative. Not through force, not through the suppression of her genuine fears, but through the patient, consistent practice of speaking a different kind of truth, one that was not yet fully believed, but was being chosen deliberately as the direction of travel. I am supported. Life moves in my favor. At first, the words arrived as strangers, slightly uncomfortable in the interior space that had been furnished so long with different assumptions. But she continued, not because it felt immediately transformative, but because the principle made a kind of deep sense she could not dismiss. And gradually, over days and then weeks, the stranger became familiar. The chosen truth began to settle, and her outer experience, that faithful mirror, began with the quiet inevitability of all genuine resonance to shift. The universe does not evaluate your sincerity. It does not award trust to those who have earned it through suffering or distinguished it through discipline. It responds with simple, precise faithfulness to the most consistent frequency your inner voice broadcasts. When that frequency carries the signature of trust, of quiet, unforced confidence in the general direction of your unfolding, the external world reconfigures itself to match. Not because trust is a technique that manipulates outcomes, but because trust is a state of inner alignment that removes the interference between your desires and their manifestation. Perspective is perhaps the most underestimated creative tool available to a human consciousness. Beatrice Goodwin had spent years in a particular relationship with the unexpected, one of resistance, of frustration, of the feeling that life was a series of obstacles placed deliberately in her path. A missed connection was a punishment. An unexpected cancellation was a personal affront. The delays and redirections that life continually offered her were received as evidence of a universe that was, at best, indifferent, and at worst, actively working against her intentions. Her inner commentary on these events was a continuous broadcast of grievance, and that broadcast shaped the tone of every day. Then, one ordinary autumn morning, something shifted. A delay she would normally have met with irritation revealed itself, in retrospect, as a protection. A moment in which life had quietly redirected her away from a situation that would have cost her more than the delay did. The realization arrived not as a dramatic insight, but as a quiet question. What if this has been true all along? What if the redirections were not obstacles, but intelligence? What if the delays were not punishments, but calibrations? Truman Fields had built his inner life around precisely this question. Where others saw roadblocks, he had trained himself to perceive design, not naively, not by refusing to acknowledge the genuine difficulty of unexpected changes, but by consistently choosing the interpretation that opened rather than closed, that moved toward understanding rather than resistance. When plans dissolved, he would pause and ask, "What is being made available by this dissolution?" His inner conversation had become less a commentary on what was happening and more an active inquiry into what was being offered. This is one of the most profound reorientations available to a human mind, the shift from a posture of resistance to a posture of inquiry. When you stop fighting the current and start reading its intelligence, the entire character of your navigation changes. You are no longer struggling against life. You are learning its language. And its language, it turns out, is one of consistent movement toward your highest available good, even when the route it chooses looks, from the limited perspective of your current position, like a detour. A closed door is not a rejection, it is a redirection, life's way of guiding you toward an opening that your current perspective cannot yet see. A delay is not a punishment. It is a period of preparation, the universe taking the time to align what you have asked for with circumstances capable of receiving it. When you hold these interpretations consistently, not as comforting fictions, but as genuine recognitions of how the intelligence of existence operates, the texture of your daily experience changes in ways that are difficult to fully articulate, but impossible to miss once experienced. The agreement of spirit, the recognition that you are not navigating this journey alone, not separated from the source of creation or from the web of consciousness that connects all living experience, is perhaps the most quietly radical understanding available. Esther Vaughan had spent years in the quiet company of a belief she had never consciously chosen, that she was fundamentally isolated, that her experience was essentially solitary, that the connections available to her were thin and unreliable, prone to dissolving without warning. Her inner narrative of aloneness was not a complaint. It had long since passed the stage of feeling like something that could change. It simply felt like the truth of her situation. But the teaching that arrived in her life challenged this at its foundation, not by offering false reassurance or by papering over genuine experience with optimistic language, but by pointing to something real. The actual nature of existence is not one of separation. It is one of connection, not sentimental, not abstract, but structural. Every breath you take participates in an exchange with the larger field of life. Every thought you hold radiates into a web of consciousness that extends far beyond the boundaries of your individual experience. You are not a solitary traveler. You are a node in an intricate and living network, one whose connections are not always visible, but are always present. Lester Haynes had organized his daily life around this recognition in a way that was simple but transformative. He moved through his days not as someone making transactions with indifferent strangers, but as someone participating in an ongoing, largely invisible collaboration. His practice was quiet, a silent interior acknowledgement of the inherent worth and shared nature of every person he encountered, not as a performance of spiritual correctness, but as a genuine, felt recognition. You are part of what I am part of. What flows through you flows through me. This quiet interior stance changed the quality of every interaction, not because the other people knew what he was doing, but because he did. And that internal shift, broadcast consistently, changed what the interactions became. Resistance, the chronic, habitual posture of fighting against the current of life rather than reading its intelligence and moving with it, is one of the most costly inner stances available. Ruth Donnelly knew this cost intimately, though for years she had not recognized it as a choice. She had understood her relentless need to control outcomes as a form of diligence, of responsibility, of the serious engagement with life that serious circumstances demanded. Her inner dialogue was a continuous work of management, mapping, planning, anticipating, adjusting, bracing. And the irony, which she could not yet see from inside it, was that all of this effort was producing less, not more, of what she genuinely wanted. George Palmer had found the doorway out of this particular room. It was not a door marked with anything that resembled weakness or passivity or the abandonment of genuine desire. It was a door marked with a different quality of inner engagement, one that held desires with open hands rather than clenched ones, that trusted the intelligence of the unfolding rather than demanding to direct every detail of its movement. He had learned that the universe is not a machine to be operated, but a collaborator to be engaged, one that responds not to the force of your grip, but to the quality of your inner alignment. When George released his need to dictate the precise shape of each outcome while maintaining the clarity of his deepest intentions, something extraordinary occurred. The outcomes that arrived were not lesser than what he had planned. They were more fitting, more sustainable, more genuinely aligned with what he had actually wanted, beneath all the demanding. The language you use to speak to yourself determines not only how you feel, but what you become available to receive. Polly Whitman had spent decades using humor as a precision instrument aimed with remarkable accuracy at herself. Her self-deprecating wit had become so automatic, so socially rewarded, so thoroughly woven into her identity, that she had long since stopped recognizing it as a choice. But every jest at her own expense, however lightly delivered, was a message received at a level far below the surface of laughter. The subconscious does not distinguish between words spoken in jest and words spoken in earnest. It receives them all as instruction, and the cumulative instruction of years of self-directed diminishment was a portrait of limitation, not dramatic, not obvious, but pervasive and persistent. Jerome Tate had discovered a different interior tone, one that could acknowledge imperfection with genuine warmth rather than disguised criticism. His humor about himself was real, but it was the humor of appreciation rather than the humor of self-correction. He could laugh at the full, complicated, occasionally absurd texture of his humanity, without that laughter containing a hidden verdict. And the difference, invisible from the outside, profound from the inside, was that his inner landscape became a place he could actually inhabit comfortably, not a performance space, a home. And from that home, his outer world began to reflect a different quality of experience, one in which he was taken seriously, not because he demanded it, but because he had first extended it to himself. Vivian Scott had believed for most of her life that her inner thoughts were private, that what passed through her consciousness in the unwitnessed moments of her day was contained there, affecting nothing beyond her own experience. The teaching that arrived to challenge this assumption was not comfortable, but it was liberating in the way that only genuine truth can be. Your thoughts are not private events. They are transmissions. The compassionate thought you extend toward a stranger in the silence of your own mind does not stay there. It moves. It participates in the larger field of consciousness that connects all experience, contributing its frequency to the ongoing composition of collective reality. Clarence Brown had made this understanding the foundation of a simple daily practice. During his morning commute, surrounded by strangers whose inner lives were as complex and as burdened as his own, he chose to offer quiet, genuine goodwill, not as a technique, not as a strategy, but as a sincere expression of his recognition of shared experience. The tired worker, the distracted student, the weary driver navigating the same difficult morning. He held each of them briefly and genuinely in a field of interior kindness, and over time, with a subtlety that he might have dismissed if he had not been paying attention, the quality of the world he moved through began to shift. Interactions softened. Small moments of unexpected grace appeared with increasing frequency. The atmosphere of his daily experience changed, not because external circumstances had changed, but because the frequency of his inner broadcast had. You are not a passive recipient of a fixed world. You are a continuous participant in its ongoing construction. Every thought you hold, every interior tone you inhabit, every quality of attention you bring to your inner conversation is a contribution to the field of experience, yours, and in ways you may never be able to trace directly, others. This is not a burden. It is an invitation to recognize that the most impactful work you will ever do may be invisible, conducted in the quiet of your own consciousness, in the unwitnessed moments of your daily interior life. When circumstances push, when the pressure of difficulty rises, and the temptation to respond with reactive inner noise is strong, the wisdom available here points in a counterintuitive direction. Lower the volume, breathe, speak softly to the situation from the deepest available stillness within you. Not as a beggar, not as a combatant, as a calm and grounded architect who knows that the interior state they choose in this moment will shape the exterior reality that follows it. Those who find themselves moved by what is being described here, who notice something shifting in their interior posture as they encounter these ideas, sometimes find meaning in pausing to acknowledge the moment. The number 520, across various traditions of awareness and resonance, is associated with the recognition of love as a structural principle of existence. The understanding that the universe is not indifferent to your experience, but is, in its most essential nature, oriented toward your well-being. If that recognition feels present in you now, you are in good company. Some simply write it as a quiet signal of arrival. The art of speaking to your desires with the elegance of someone who already understands their nature, not as distant possibilities to be chased, but as realities already in the process of becoming, is one of the most refined capacities a conscious mind can develop. F. A. Peterson had spent years in the exhausting posture of someone who believed that intensity equaled effectiveness. She pushed. She demanded. She approached her aspirations with the urgency of someone who feared that, without constant pressure, nothing would move. And in a painful irony that she could not yet see from inside it, the very force she applied was creating the resistance she most feared. The universe does not respond to aggression. It responds to alignment. And alignment is, by its nature, a quiet thing. Roy Collins had discovered this through a process of gradual unlearning, the shedding of the belief that desire must be pursued with force in order to be fulfilled. He had found instead that his aspirations responded most readily not to the pressure he applied, but to the quality of inner standing from which he addressed them. He spoke to his goals not as a general issuing commands to reluctant troops, but as a host welcoming honored guests. His inner conversation carried the tone of gracious expectation, not the frantic energy of need, but the settled quality of someone who has prepared well and trusts that what is invited will arrive. And it did. Not always on the schedule his thinking mind preferred, but with a consistency and a quality that forceful demanding had never produced. Your desires are not enemies to be conquered or prizes to be seized. They are natural expressions of the creative intelligence moving through you, signals from the deeper current of your becoming, pointing toward the experiences and expressions that are most aligned with your truest nature. When you approach them with reverence rather than aggression, with patient certainty rather than frantic grasping, they respond with a grace that force can never summon. The practice is not about lowering your expectations. It is about elevating the quality of your inner relationship with what you are creating. Sincerity is the element that most people overlook when they encounter the practice of inner dialogue. Della Hurst had learned the vocabulary of affirmation, had acquired the language of abundance and possibility, but something in the delivery was hollow. The words arrived correctly, but beneath them, an older and more deeply held current was broadcasting something different. Her lips said, "I am worthy." Her deeper frequency said, "I have never quite believed that." And the universe, that exquisitely sensitive receiver, heard both, but responded to the one broadcast with greater consistency and emotional force. Not the surface statement, the underlying signal. Vernon Steele had taken a different approach, one that at first glance might have appeared to be the opposite of affirmation, but was in fact a more sophisticated form of it. Before speaking words of courage, he first created space to acknowledge the fear that was genuinely present, not to amplify it, not to give it authority over his choices, but to honor its presence with the kind of honest recognition that dissolves resistance rather than compounding it. "I am afraid," he would say to himself, with a gentleness that contained no judgment. And in that acknowledgement, something extraordinary would occur. The fear, seen clearly and met with compassion rather than suppression, would begin to lose its grip. And from that more honest interior ground, his words of courage would emerge with a resonance they had never carried when spoken over a backdrop of unacknowledged doubt. This is the teaching of sincere alignment. Your affirmations are most powerful not when they are most perfectly worded, but when they emerge from the most honestly inhabited interior ground. You do not need to feel perfect confidence before you speak the language of possibility. You need only to bring genuine honesty to where you actually are, to acknowledge the fear, the doubt, the uncertainty with kindness rather than judgment, and then, from that honest ground, to choose the direction you are moving. The bridge between where you are and where you are going is built not from pretended certainty, but from genuine, compassionate willingness to move. Waiting, the experience of desires held and not yet manifested, of intentions set and not yet visible, is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the creative process. Matilda Kerr had experienced waiting primarily as frustration, as evidence that something was wrong, that the process had stalled, that she was doing something incorrectly, or that the universe was withholding what should by now have arrived. Her inner commentary on periods of apparent stillness was a continuous broadcast of impatience, of resistance to the timing of her own unfolding. And that resistance, it turned out, was itself one of the primary factors extending the very delays she was lamenting. Lyle Harmon had found a different relationship with the same experience. He had come to understand, not as a comforting idea, but as a lived recognition, that the periods between intention and manifestation were not empty. They were full of the invisible work of alignment, of circumstances being arranged, of timing being calibrated, of conditions being prepared that his current perspective could not yet see. His inner conversation during these periods was not one of frustrated waiting, but of active trust. This moment is part of the preparation. What is being assembled for me is more complete than what I could have arranged myself. And the outcomes that eventually arrived confirmed, with a consistency that gradually transformed his understanding, that the timing he had once resisted had been, in fact, more intelligent than his impatience. Delays are not denials, they are refinements. The universe does not withhold what you have genuinely aligned with. It prepares it, seasons it with the wisdom, the timing, and the circumstantial alignment that your current perspective cannot fully appreciate. When you can hold this understanding not as a consoling story, but as a genuine recognition of how the intelligence of existence operates, waiting transforms from an obstacle into a form of active participation in your own becoming. The inner landscape you inhabit when no one is watching, when there is no performance to maintain, no image to project, no external demand shaping your presentation, is the most honest report available on the frequency you are actually broadcasting. Cora Beck had spent years speaking affirmations into empty rooms and feeling, with an honesty she could not dismiss, that something was missing. The words were correct. The practice was diligent, but the felt sense of genuine reception, of actually being heard, of the words landing somewhere real, was absent. And without that felt sense, the words remained what they had always been. Words. Harry Boone had discovered what Cora had not yet found, that consciousness is not a distant or indifferent audience for your inner conversation. It is an omnipresent, attentive, and intimately responsive field that receives every nuance of your interior life with a sensitivity that exceeds any human listener. When Harry spoke to himself with genuine kindness, when he acknowledged his struggles with real compassion, when he extended to himself the same quality of understanding he would offer a person he loved. He was not performing for an invisible audience. He was participating in a real relationship, and that relationship tended with consistency and sincerity, responded with the same faithfulness that all genuine relationships produce when they are genuinely tended. Your inner world is not separate from the larger intelligence of existence. It is a localized expression of it, a particular personal inflection of the universal consciousness that animates all experience. When you speak to yourself with reverence, you are not merely being kind to yourself. You are aligning your personal frequency with the deeper current of creation that is always moving toward your highest available good. And that alignment, quiet, consistent, genuine, is the most powerful creative act available to you. Your energetic signature, the frequency you carry into every room, every conversation, every unguarded moment of your daily existence, is determined not by what you say aloud, but by what you say to yourself in the spaces between all visible performance. Lucille North had spent decades diminishing her own arrival. Her introductions carried apology before they carried presence. Her contributions entered conversations already dressed in the language of qualification. And the world, receiving the signal she was broadcasting with such consistent fluency, responded in kind, treating her with the same absence of weight that she had already assigned to herself. She had not been overlooked by life. She had, through the faithfulness of her inner voice, instructed life in how to overlook her. The shift that transformed Lucille's experience was not dramatic. It did not arrive with ceremony or announce itself with obvious fanfare. It began as a quiet decision, made in an unremarkable moment, without any particular feeling of significance, to stop apologizing for her own existence, not in her external speech, where the apologies had long since become habitual and largely invisible, but in the deeper interior conversation that preceded all external speech. She began with the patient consistency of someone planting in unfamiliar soil, to affirm her own value, not as an argument against doubt, but as a quiet, settled recognition. I bring something real. My presence matters. And gradually, with the same unhurried inevitability that characterizes all genuine inner change, the world around her began to reflect a different story. Milton Gray had understood the power of energetic preparation, of the inner work done before any external engagement. Where others might spend the moments before a difficult meeting rehearsing potential problems, he would use those same moments to center himself in a felt sense of calm expectation, not the forced optimism of someone trying to think their way into a better mood, but the genuine, settled quality of a person who has chosen, deliberately and in advance, the inner state from which they will engage. And that choice, made quietly, without announcement, in the interior space that no one else could access, changed the quality of every interaction that followed. Your emotional signature instructs circumstances before a single word is spoken. This is the understanding that transforms the entire approach to preparation. You do not prepare for important moments by rehearsing what might go wrong. You prepare by choosing in advance and with genuine intention the inner frequency from which you will meet whatever arrives. The inner state you inhabit walking into a room is the most powerful determinant of what that room becomes for you. Not the words you have prepared, not the strategy you have developed, the frequency you are broadcasting from the inside in the unguarded moment before the performance begins. Nancy Rhodes had kept, for years, a chronicle of her own limitation, a record written with the sincere intention of self-understanding. That had gradually become something else, a monument, a fixed narrative of who she was based on the accumulated evidence of what had already been. She had not understood, in the writing of it, that she was doing something more than recording. She was reinforcing. Every return to the story of her wounds was a fresh planting of those wounds in the fertile ground of her subconscious. Every rereading of her failures was a reinstruction to the universe about what to continue providing. Her diary was not a path toward healing. It had become a blueprint for its own continuation. The reorientation that changed everything was not the abandonment of honest self-reflection. It was the transformation of the interpretive lens through which her history was held. Douglas Pratt had walked through similar territory and found the same doorway, the recognition that the meaning of past experience is not fixed, it is chosen. The setback that has always appeared in your interior story as evidence of your limitation can, with genuine willingness and a shift of perspective, be reread as evidence of your resilience. The rejection that has lived in your narrative as proof of your unworthiness can be understood instead as the redirection that made the better path available. Your history is not an argument against you. It is the material from which your particular form of strength has been forged. This rewriting is not dishonesty. It is not the construction of a false narrative over the true one. It is the recognition that every experience contains more than one true story, and that the story you choose to inhabit shapes the life that follows more than the events themselves ever could. Your past does not determine your future. Your interpretation of your past does. And interpretation is always, no matter how deeply habituated it has become, a choice. Certainty, the quality of inner knowing that does not require external validation before it will declare itself, is perhaps the most consistently misunderstood element of the creative process. Ida Jo Harris had lived for years in the uncomfortable territory between wanting and believing, holding genuine desires while simultaneously harboring a fundamental uncertainty about whether those desires were truly available to her. Her inner conversation was qualified, hedged, careful, the speech of someone who had learned not to want too openly, not to expect too clearly, not to claim too certainly, because certainty felt dangerous, felt like the setup for a particularly painful disappointment. Leonard Cobb had moved through the same world from a completely different interior position. His certainty was not arrogance, not the brittle overconfidence of someone who had never been genuinely challenged. It was the deep, settled quality of a person who had come to understand through lived experience that the universe responds most reliably to the frequency of unambiguous inner knowing. He did not hope things would resolve. He knew, with a quiet that needed no defense, that the intelligence organizing his experience was oriented toward his well-being, and that knowing, consistent, unperformed, genuinely inhabited, produced outcomes that hope, however fervent, had never reliably delivered. The creative password of certainty is not a state you achieve once and then maintain effortlessly. It is a practice, a daily, sometimes moment-by-moment choice to inhabit the inner posture of knowing rather than the inner posture of hoping. When doubt arrives, as it will, the practice is not to suppress it, but to acknowledge it with the same compassionate honesty that Vernon Steele brought to his fears, and then, from that honest ground, to choose again the direction of certainty, not because the doubt has been defeated, but because you have decided that certainty is the frequency from which you are choosing to create. Annie Pearl Mason had spent years in the corrosive company of her own inner critic, a voice so practiced, so fluent, so thoroughly woven into the background of her daily experience that she had long since stopped recognizing it as a voice at all. It simply felt like clarity, like the honest assessment of someone who saw things as they were. But the inner critic is not clarity. It is a habit, one of the most costly habits available, because it broadcasts, with the emotional force of genuine belief, a signal of fundamental inadequacy that the universe receives and reflects with faithful precision. Norman Blair had discovered the practice that dissolves this habit, not through confrontation, not through the forceful replacement of critical thoughts with positive ones, but through the cultivation of a different quality of inner attention altogether. When a critical thought arose, he would notice it, not engage it, not argue with it, not replace it with an equal and opposite assertion, but simply meet it with the kind of gentle, unhurried compassion he might extend to a person who was suffering unnecessarily. "You are learning," he would tell himself. "You are in the middle of something real, and you are finding your way through it." And in that quality of inner tenderness, the critical voice would lose its authority, not because it had been defeated, but because it had been met with something it could not sustain itself against: genuine, unhurried kindness. This is the practice of compassion as a creative force, not sentiment, not the performance of niceness over honest experience, but the genuine extension of understanding to yourself. The recognition that your journey is real, that its difficulty is real, that you are doing the actual work of becoming in real time, and that this work deserves the same quality of patient support you would offer to anyone you genuinely cared about. Georgia Bright had understood the art of declaration not as the forceful announcement of what she demanded, but as the quiet, steady utterance of what she recognized to be true at a level deeper than current evidence. Her declarations were not battle's cries. They were recognitions, calm, unhurried, rooted in the understanding that what she was speaking into existence was not a fabrication, but a revelation. Floyd Sutton had found the same ground through a different path, through the gradual, genuine shift from a narrative of scarcity to one of natural abundance. Not because his circumstances had first changed to justify the shift, but because he had decided, with a clarity that felt both simple and profound, that the story of abundance was more true than the story of lack, and that his inner voice, from this moment forward, would reflect that recognition. "Abundance flows through me naturally," he would say, "not as a demand, not as a wish, but as the quiet declaration of someone who has understood that prosperity is not something external to be acquired, but something internal to be recognized and expressed. And the universe, receiving this signal with its characteristic faithfulness, began organizing his experience around the frequency of that recognition. Reverence, the quality of genuine, felt appreciation for the ordinary moments of daily existence, is one of the most quietly powerful inner states available. Rose Clay had moved through her days for years with the disconnection of someone performing tasks rather than inhabiting moments. The dishes were an obligation. The cooking was a chore. The daily rhythms of domestic existence were obstacles between herself and the more significant experiences she was waiting for. And in that waiting, in that posture of perpetual deferral, the sacredness of the actual texture of her life remained entirely invisible to her. Chester, who understood something that most people never encounter, had learned to bring the quality of genuine attention, of real, present moment awareness to the most unremarkable actions of his daily life. When he washed dishes, he was actually washing dishes, not mentally elsewhere, not enduring the task until something more interesting arrived, but genuinely present to the water, the warmth, the simple physical reality of the moment. And in that presence, something extraordinary became available that is never accessible in the state of distracted endurance. The recognition that this moment, exactly as it is already complete, already sufficient, already in its own quiet way, extraordinary. Your consciousness is the alchemy that transforms the ordinary into the sacred, not through any external change in what you are doing, but through the quality of inner attention you bring to the doing. When you move through your days with genuine presence, when you allow yourself to actually be where you are, rather than perpetually somewhere else in your mind, the texture of your experience changes in ways that cannot be fully explained, but are unmistakable once encountered. Life does not become more dramatic. It becomes more real. And in that greater reality, a quiet joy becomes available that no amount of chasing more significant experiences has ever been able to produce. Ella Durham had believed that authority, the capacity to shape circumstances according to her intentions, was something that had to be asserted with force, that the world would yield only to pressure, that quiet confidence was naive, that softness was weakness, that the only reliable way to ensure outcomes was to maintain a vigilant, effortful, relentless grip on every variable. And she was exhausted, not from the difficulty of her circumstances, but from the enormous and ultimately futile effort of trying to control what could not, in its nature, be controlled. Basil Crane had found the authority that Ella sought, but had found it in precisely the opposite direction, not in greater force, but in deeper stillness, not in louder assertion, but in quieter certainty. His inner voice, when challenges arose, did not escalate. It settled. It breathed. It issued forth its intentions not as demands hurled against resistance, but as quiet, unshakable recognitions of what was already true at a level that circumstances had not yet caught up to. And the circumstances, receiving that signal from a frequency of genuine stillness rather than anxious force, recalibrated with a grace that force had never been able to produce. True power does not shout. It does not need to. It simply knows, with the kind of settled, unhurried certainty that needs no volume to be heard, that the interior state it inhabits is already shaping the exterior reality that follows. And from that knowing, it speaks, softly, steadily, with the quiet authority of something that understands its own nature and does not require the world's confirmation before it acts from that understanding. Ethel Parks had approached the question of receiving with a complexity that was, at its root, quite simple. She did not believe, at the level where beliefs actually operate, that she was genuinely worthy of what she was asking for. Her prayers were real, her desires were genuine, but beneath every request ran a quiet, persistent current of unworthiness, the felt sense that grace was something distributed to others. That abundance was something available to people who deserved it in ways she had not yet managed to deserve it. And that current, broadcast with the consistency of deep and unexamined belief, interrupted the very reception it was hoping for. Nolan Wyatt had transformed his relationship with receiving through a shift so simple it almost resisted taking seriously. He had decided that worthiness was not something earned, but something recognized. That the capacity to receive was not a reward for having lived correctly, but a fundamental aspect of his nature as a conscious being participating in a universe that was, in its essential orientation, generous. Yes, this good is mine, he would say, not with arrogance, not with the aggressive claiming of something that needed to be seized, but with the quiet, graceful acknowledgement of someone accepting what had always been available. This is the final and perhaps most essential understanding the journey offers. Receiving is a practice. It requires the same quality of conscious intention that all genuine inner work requires. When praise arrives, when opportunity presents itself, when abundance offers itself in any of its forms, the practice is to receive it fully, to breathe into it, to allow it to land without immediately deflecting it, minimizing it, or questioning whether it was truly meant for you. Your willingness to receive is the completion of the creative circuit. Desire without the capacity to receive is a signal without a landing point. But when you cultivate genuine openness, when you train your inner voice to say yes to the good that is already moving toward you, the circuit completes. And what has been in motion begins with the quiet inevitability of all genuine alignment to arrive. Sally Dean had spent years speaking the language of abundance while simultaneously, in the unguarded moments of genuine interaction, deflecting its messengers. A compliment would land, and she would immediately qualify it. Recognition would arrive, and she would redirect it. The inner voice that whispered they don't really mean, that was not protecting her from false praise. It was interrupting the flow of genuine recognition, breaking the circuit at the very moment of completion. Arthur Mills had understood this and had made a different practice. When appreciation arrived, he received it, simply, fully, without the performance of false modesty or the defense of habitual deflection. Yes, he would say inwardly, that is true. And in that quiet, graceful acceptance, something would shift, an expansion, a subtle but real opening of the interior space available for more. The voice within you that speaks with patience, with genuine amusement, at the full and complicated texture of being human. with the kind of certainty that does not require evidence before it declares itself. That voice is not something you are building from scratch. It is something you are remembering, something that has always been present beneath the accumulated layers of doubt and inherited limitation and the habitual static of an unexamined inner life. The practice is not creation, it is excavation, the clearing away of what has been placed over what was always there. When you speak to yourself as the most intelligent, most loving, most patient version of your own deepest nature would speak, when you bring to your inner conversation the quality of understanding that you most wish the world would offer you, you are not performing a technique. You are coming home to a voice that has always known your worth, that has never required evidence of your deservingness, that has been speaking beneath all the noise with the quiet certainty of something that understands what you are made of. This is the invitation that closes the journey, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, not as the end of something completed, but as the threshold of something that, for those who choose it, never ends. Each morning brings a fresh opportunity to orient your inner voice toward what you are choosing to create. Each moment of genuine stillness brings access to the deeper current of knowing that is always available. Each breath can carry the quality of genuine, unhurried trust in the intelligence of your own unfolding. The conversation between your consciousness and the universe has been ongoing since the first moment of your awareness. It will continue long after this particular encounter with these ideas has passed. The only question that remains, the only question that has ever truly mattered, is what you will choose to say. Speak, therefore, with the understanding that every utterance is real, that every inner declaration is received, that the voice you use to speak to yourself is the most powerful creative instrument available to you, and that it is always, in every moment, already at work. Those who have traveled through this entire exploration, who have stayed with the full arc of what has been offered here, often find themselves at a natural threshold, not of conclusion, but of quiet recognition. There is a number, 888, that appears across many traditions of awareness as a symbol of infinite flow, of the creative current moving without obstruction between intention and manifestation, between the inner voice and the outer world it is always already shaping. And there is 333, the frequency of alignment between mind, voice, and reality, the signal that what you have been hearing is not new information, but remembered truth. If something in this journey has landed in you with the quality of recognition rather than information, if the voice you have been listening to as you encountered these ideas has, at any point, sounded quietly like your own, you are not required to do anything with that. But some people, in moments like this, find it meaningful to mark the convergence, not as a task, not as a performance of engagement, but as the quiet, personal acknowledgement of someone who has heard something true and has chosen in this moment to let it be known. If this resonated, if somewhere in the movement of these ideas something shifted even slightly in the quality of your inner conversation, those who feel moved sometimes leave a number: 777, 1111, 520, 888, 333, not because they were asked to, but because they recognized something. And recognition, quietly expressed, is its own form of creation. Cecilia Boone had discovered, through years of affirmation practice that had produced inconsistent results, that the missing element was never the words themselves. She had spoken the right phrases, she had followed the right sequences, she had repeated her chosen declarations with a diligence that no one could have questioned. But the breath that carried those words was shallow, constricted with the quiet, unacknowledged tension of someone who was performing rather than inhabiting. And performance, however skillful, does not carry the same creative frequency as genuine, embodied knowing. The universe does not respond to your technique, it responds to your truth. Edgar Morris had transformed his entire relationship with inner speech through the discovery that breath was not merely the vehicle for his words, but their foundation. When he allowed genuine, unhurried breath to proceed and carry each inner declaration, when he felt the words settle into his body rather than hover in the space above it, the quality of what was transmitted changed entirely. Abundance, spoken on a constricted breath, carries the frequency of scarcity dressed in hopeful language. Spoken on a breath that is genuinely open, genuinely relaxed, genuinely trusting, it carries the frequency of what it actually names. The body knows the difference, and the field of existence that receives your broadcast knows it too. This is the understanding that brings the entire exploration into its most practical expression. The work of inner transformation is not solely a mental activity. It is a whole being practice. Your thoughts shape your words, but your breath shapes the frequency those words carry. Your intentions direct your inner conversation, but the felt quality of your body, open or contracted, trusting or braced, determines whether that conversation is broadcast with the full creative power available to it or filtered through the interference of unacknowledged resistance. Georgia May Hines had embodied the opposite of this understanding for years, moving through her days in a state of low-grade, anticipatory tension, expecting complications before they arrived, meeting each morning with an inner posture already slightly defended against what might go wrong. And life, that faithful correspondent, arranged itself with remarkable consistency to justify the defense, not because the universe was confirming her pessimism, but because her expectancy, that quiet, consistent, felt sense of what was coming, was itself a creative force. She was not predicting her experience, she was producing it. Rufus Day had found the same creative mechanism and oriented it in a different direction. His expectancy was not forced optimism. It was not the performance of positivity over genuine uncertainty. It was the cultivated, practiced, genuinely inhabited inner posture of someone who had decided and continued deciding daily in the small, unremarkable moments that accumulate into a life that the world was fundamentally oriented toward his well-being, that people were fundamentally kind, that what was moving toward him was, in its essential nature, good, and the world, receiving this broadcast with characteristic faithfulness, arranged itself to confirm what he had expected. Your expectancy is the lens through which all incoming experience is filtered. It determines not only how you interpret what arrives, but, at a more fundamental level, what arrives to be interpreted. This is the creative loop that most people never examine. The inner state produces the outer experience, which appears to confirm the inner state, which deepens it, which strengthens the outer experience. The loop runs in both directions with equal faithfulness, which means that the entry point, the place where conscious choice becomes available, is always the inner state, not the circumstances, not the history, the inner state, chosen now, in this moment, from this breath. Agnes Cooper had found her entry point through the unlikely doorway of generosity. She had expected that giving from a position of scarcity would deepen the scarcity, that the resource she extended outward was a resource she was losing. But Wallace Gentry had shown her, through the lived example of his own transformed experience, that the law of circulation operates on a different logic entirely. What flows through you returns to you, not as a transaction, not as a reward for correct behavior, but as the natural consequence of having opened the channel. When you give from genuine fullness, when your generosity is an expression of genuine abundance rather than a sacrifice made from genuine lack, you are broadcasting, with every act of giving, the signal that you are connected to an inexhaustible source, and the universe, receiving that signal, confirms it. Olive Randall had discovered the bridge between inner practice and outer life through the costly experience of a spiritual practice that remained sealed in its own container, present and genuine during meditation, entirely absent the moment she stepped back into the demands of her ordinary day. The peace she cultivated in stillness would shatter on contact with difficulty, and she would spend the day attempting to remember, from a distance, what she had felt in the morning. The teaching that transformed this was not a new technique. It was a recognition. The quality of inner alignment you cultivate in stillness is not a separate state to be visited and then left. It is the frequency you are choosing to inhabit consistently. In the meeting, in the difficult conversation, in the moment of unexpected challenge, in all the unremarkable transitions of an ordinary day. Blaine Mercer had made this his practice, not the achievement of perfect serenity in all circumstances, but the consistent, patient return to his chosen inner frequency whenever he noticed he had drifted from it. The same serenity follows me everywhere, not as an assertion that nothing difficult would arrive, but as a commitment to the quality of inner ground from which he would meet whatever arrived. And gradually, with the consistency that all genuine inner work eventually produces, the return became easier. The drift became shorter. The chosen frequency became, over time, less a practice he applied and more a quality he carried. The journey that began with the recognition that your inner dialogue is not private, that it is the most consequential creative broadcast you will ever make, arrives here at its most essential and most personal truth. Every story explored along the way, every character who found their way from a limiting inner narrative to a liberating one, every transformation that moved from the inside out rather than the outside in, all of it has been pointing toward this single, quiet, profound understanding. You are not the passive narrator of a life that happens to you. You are its author, not in the sense that you control every variable or determine every outcome. The universe retains, thankfully, its own intelligence and its own timing, but in the sense that the quality of the inner conversation you maintain consistently and genuinely across all the ordinary moments of your existence is the primary creative force shaping the experience that follows. Not occasionally, not in dramatic moments of intentional manifestation, always, in the background of every day, running beneath every surface interaction, the voice you use to speak to yourself is building the world you inhabit. This is not a burden. It is the most liberating truth available to a conscious human being, because it means that the power to shift your experience does not reside in circumstances beyond your reach. It does not require the cooperation of other people or the alignment of external conditions. It resides in the quality of the conversation you are having with yourself right now, and in all the moments that follow this one. Speak, therefore, with the understanding that you are always being heard, not by a judgmental audience waiting to evaluate your performance, by the most attentive, most faithful, most responsive intelligence available, the one that has been listening since the first moment of your awareness and has been answering with precise and patient faithfulness every single thing you have said. Speak as someone who knows their own worth. Speak as someone who trusts the direction of their unfolding. Speak as someone who understands that what is moving toward them is, in its essential nature, already good, already calibrated, already prepared, already in motion. Speak with the patience of someone who has learned that timing is not delay, but wisdom. Speak with the openness of someone who has learned that receiving is not weakness, but completion. And when the voice of doubt arrives, as it will, because doubt is part of being genuinely human, meet it not with force, but with the same quiet, unhurried compassion you would extend to anyone finding their way through real difficulty. Acknowledge it. Honor its presence. And then, from that honest and compassionate ground, choose again. Choose the direction of trust. Choose the frequency of genuine knowing. Choose the inner conversation that builds the life you are actually here to live. This is the practice, not a formula, not a guarantee, a living, breathing, daily, moment-by-moment commitment to the quality of your own inner voice. Simple in its essence, profound in its consequences, available to you in every moment, without exception, beginning now. If something in this journey has moved through you with the quality of genuine recognition, if the voice you have been hearing as you traveled through these ideas has, at any point, sounded like something you already knew, then what you have encountered here is not new information. It is a remembering, a return to the understanding that was always present beneath the noise. Those who feel that return sometimes choose to mark it quietly, not as a task, not as a performance of engagement, but as the personal, private acknowledgement of a moment when something true was recognized. If that is where you find yourself now, you are in good company. Some leave a number, 777, for alignment between intention and reality, 1111 for the convergence of inner knowing and outer possibility, 520 for the recognition of love as the structural principle beneath all creation, 888 for the infinite flow between what you speak inwardly and what the world returns, 333 for the harmony of mind, voice, and lived experience finally moving as one, not because they were asked, but because they recognized something. And in this quiet, intelligent space, in MindRise audiobooks, where these explorations are offered not as prescriptions, but as invitations, recognition, gently expressed, is always welcome.